Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome one, welcome all to the night that you have all been waiting for. It is finally here on this beautiful, freezing Wednesday night. We are gathered here for the debate between Monash Christian Union and the Monash Philosophy Society. We are so excited to have you all with us tonight, in person and online, as we think, talk and learn with each other about both sides to this big question. We hope that tonight is an opportunity to hear views that we might not have heard before, ask questions that have been on our minds, and of course, enjoy the evening. My name is Josh. I'm a fourth year commerce and German student. I think that everyone who says they like dark chocolate is lying, and I'll be our MC for tonight. Tonight, we're going to hear from our two hosts, Monash Christian Union and Monash Philosophy Society, as they debate the question, is Christian morality better than secular morality? In this debate, as you may have already guessed, Monash Christian Union will be the affirmative side, arguing that Christian morality is better than secular morality, and Monash Philosophy Society will be the negative side. We'll have time allocated for questions, so we'd encourage you to be thinking about questions related to the debate throughout. Maybe something doesn't quite make sense, or maybe you just want more information or clarification. I think we can all agree that we want to hear these questions. Later in the evening, there'll be a QR code on the screens behind me. And for those tuning in live on YouTube, there'll be a link in the chat. Please do submit questions there, and we'd ask that you hold any questions until that section of the evening. We'll also have a short intermission at 7:15, but who knows if it'll be 7:15, it might be a bit later. But without further ado, your speakers for this evening. Tonight, debating for Monash Christian Union, we have Patrick Grocott and Benjamin Kelly. That will put them at ease. It's good that you've clapped them. Patrick is a fifth-year mechanical engineering and commerce student, and Ben is a second-year politics, philosophy and economics student interested in the intersection between philosophy and theology. Debating for the Monash Philosophy Society, we have Noah Martin and Janset Selbus. Noah is a philosophy student interested in ethics and philosophy of religion, and Janset is a fourth-year science and arts student studying physiology, physics, and philosophy. Could we please give a warm welcome also to our moderator for this evening from the Monash Philosophy Department, Dr. Jean Flannery.
Thanks very much, Josh. I just want to second Josh's excitement. It's fantastic to see so many people turning out for another episode in the interminable debate between Athens and Jerusalem. Right? We haven't yet reached a resolution. We perhaps won't reach one tonight, but it's nonetheless been an extremely productive debate in the history of ideas. So I'm really looking forward to it. I think Josh has covered most of the detail. We're going to begin with opening statements, 8 minutes each. So first from Pat, and then from Noah, and then from Ben, and then from Janset. And then we're going to move over to this cross-examination section, whose rules I'll explain when we get there. Then we're going to have the intermission, more cross-examination, and on to Q&A. So just for the speakers, during the opening statements, I'll give one knock at 7 minutes, hopefully a little louder than that, maybe I'll give my microphone to it, and two at 8 minutes. And then during cross-examination, the rules will be a little bit different. So without further ado, thanks very much, Patrick.
Ladies and gentlemen, your life has no meaning. Your existence is pointless. Your ethics are purposeless, because in this world there is at bottom no good, no evil, nothing but blind indifference. I don't really believe those things. I was quoting Richard Dawkins, but I don't believe you believe in them either. No, if you thought morality was pointless, you wouldn't be here tonight. You're here because you believe, or at least you hope, that your life has some meaning, that there are good lives and there are bad lives, and you'd like to think you're living a good one. And we don't disagree with you. Ben and I actually think that regardless of your faith, we've got a lot in common when it comes to morality. How many of you love justice? How many of you love freedom? How many of you love your mother? Yeah, a few more. No, if we disagree with our opposition, it's on the foundation of those values. Tonight we'll present what we believe is a better foundation. A picture of what love and justice and freedom can look like when they're grounded in Jesus Christ. A picture so good, you'll want to believe it, even if you don't think it's true. Now, before we go on, let's consider the wording of our topic. When we say Christian morality, we mean moral reasoning that follows the example of Jesus Christ. When we say secular morality, we mean any moral reasoning that exists independent of God. Now, can atheists behave morally? Yes, of course. Do Christians always follow Jesus Christ? No. Regrettably, inexcusably, Christians don't always follow Christian morality. But the litmus test is not, do all Christians do it? It's, does Christ do it? Now, tonight, Ben and I will defend two basic contentions. First, that Christianity provides a good foundation for morality. And second, that secularism by itself actually provides no foundation whatsoever. I'll defend the first. Ben will tackle the second. And we'll defend these two statements by arguing that Christianity, not secularism, provides the moral resources that we need to live in this world. Now, tonight, our opposition will have many opportunities to contest these two statements, but they must do more than lob criticisms. They have to present an alternate foundation for morality. They can't simply say, oh, Christianity is the worst. Worse than what? In a moment, I'll establish our first contention, that Christianity provides a good foundation for morality. But first, a rhetorical question. What makes a moral framework good? What makes one better than another? Well, any moral framework must provide three things: moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability. Let me explain what I mean. Moral values are beliefs about right and wrong, where you draw the line between good and evil. Moral duties are the obligations that flow from those values, what you should and shouldn't do about it. And finally, moral accountability, which is the consequences of those actions. Now, if values don't exist, then you've got no way of ordering your life, right? If duties don't exist, or if they're not universal, then I can smack you in the face and you can't really say anything about it. Right, and if accountability doesn't exist, well, you can say lots of things about it, but it doesn't really matter because there's no consequences for slapping people in the face. I hope you can see that any moral framework without these three things fails at its job. You won't be able to live it out. And so now we've got three criteria that we can use to compare Christian and secular morality, which provides a better set of values, which provides a universal set of duties, which provides a means of accountability, of justice. So at any point tonight, if you've lost track of the score, you don't know who's winning, ask yourself, which moral framework has shown itself to be a better foundation for the values, duties, and accountability that I need in my life? Now, at the moment, the score is 0-all. So in the next 3 minutes, let me try and change that. Our first contention is that Christianity provides a good foundation for morality, for moral duties, for values, duties, and accountability. First, consider the values of Christ. In a culture that devalued women, Jesus was radical in the dignity and honour that he showed them. In a culture that viewed the poor as second class, Jesus calls them blessed. Jesus says, love your neighbour as yourself. But he goes one step further. Right? He immediately follows it up by saying, hey, your neighbour is the person you struggle to love. Your neighbour is the marginalised, the disabled person, the foreigner. Right? Everyone says, treat your friends well. Jesus says, love your enemies. Incredible moral teaching. But why should they be my morals? Well, we believe that Jesus wasn't just a moral teacher, that he was actually God. God who made the universe, God who made us and loved us enough to die for us. Right? The heart of the Christian faith is a man dying on the cross for his enemies, praying, God, forgive them. And so the message of Christianity isn't this domineering morality, because Christ was not domineering. He was gentle. He was humble. The God of the universe who died for me is a good foundation for moral values. Next, and somewhat related, consider duties. Within Christianity, we find an objective set of moral duties that apply to everyone. Let me explain what that means. When you say, and I hope you say, murder is wrong, you don't mean to impose your personal moral beliefs on someone else. No. You're referring to a higher moral law that applies to both of you. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that higher moral law really did exist? Well, in Christianity, you find that higher law. You find that God created the universe. So his moral law does apply to everyone. You find that every human being is made in the image of God for relationship with God. Murder is wrong because it violates a human's God-given intrinsic value. Under Christianity, I can assert a moral truth without arrogance because it's not just my truth, it's God's. And finally, accountability. Perhaps what we most desire from a moral system is justice. Under secularism, death is the end. And so the good or evil you do in this life only has consequences if you get caught. But what do you say to the Ukrainian refugee or the child slave in Pakistan? Is there accountability for their oppressors? Yes. There is justice because there is a judge. Remember that man who was God and died for you? He will deliver true, everlasting justice to all who've been wronged. Under Christianity, there is moral accountability. Christian morality is better than secular morality because it provides an absolute, invariant foundation for the values, duties, and accountability that we need in life. Under Christianity, I know my values are good for me because the one who taught them died for me. I can assert a moral duty without being arrogant. I can condemn evil in the world without condemning people. And I can yearn for justice and not be kidding myself. Without Jesus, even our best morality divides us. It says the people over there, they're bad. Us over here, we're good. Yet under Christianity, the Christian is no better than the non-Christian. You aren't accepted by God for what you do. It's all undeserved love. It's grace. The Bible says we've all done wrong. We've all fallen short of God, and we can all be forgiven and accepted by his grace. This is the morality that follows Jesus Christ. What is the better foundation? That's a question our opposition must answer. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay. So, I forgot one of my pages. Thank you. Okay, so firstly, thank you all for coming. It's always more fun to debate these kinds of things in a full room. What I'm going to do over the next few minutes is lay the groundwork for what we intend to argue, but more explicitly what we do not intend to argue, because obviously this is a very dense topic, and so we can kind of get lost in the weeds a little bit. First, we are not arguing that Christianity cannot have valuable moral principles within it. As Patrick already put forward, there are lots of principles that Jesus said, such as do unto others as you would have done unto you. These are all generally accepted as good moral principles, and we don't intend to dispute that. Secondly, we are not arguing that Christianity is not influential. And further, we're not even arguing that Christianity is not the foundation of modern Western morality and culture. We're not saying it is. We're just saying that that's not really relevant to evaluating its truth. If we were having this conversation during the Islamic Golden Age, we probably wouldn't extend to Islam the fact that it's true just based on the fact that its realm of influences have incredible scientific and cultural progress. Where Thirdly, a confusion that can happen is confusing secular versus atheistic. Secular morality does not require that we say God is not real. It's more about evaluating moral principles on their own merit, so to say, or on their own results. Secular morality, for instance, would say that explaining a moral principle by saying God said so is not sufficient. But secular morality is not about saying that God didn't say so or that God does not have the authority to say so. It's just about acknowledging that a wide range of views have all been supported on the basis of saying that God said so. And so we want to evaluate beyond that so that we can achieve more consistent results. Okay, now we will turn to what we are actually arguing. Firstly, we are arguing that Christianity does not provide any unique moral principles. So, for instance, Jesus saying, "Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself." This principle shows up in Buddhism, Confucianism, Judaism, far before the existence of Christianity. That's true for all biblical moral principles, every moral principle that Jesus has talked about. Somebody else has said it before. Secondly, we are arguing that Christianity does not have sufficient justification to claim superiority. In order to claim superiority on the basis of a theological position, we need to know that there is a God. We need to know that it's a Christian God. We need to know that morals are derived from and only from that God. And we need to know that Christianity is the best or exclusive framework of actually effectively engaging with those morals. We won't actually be engaging with the first two about the existence of God, but it's just there to illustrate how much of an undertaking it truly is to argue for superiority. Finally, we are arguing that even if Christians and the Christian side can explain all these truth claims, we can justify the existence of God, we can justify Christianity as a framework of engaging with them powerfully. We then have another problem. We have to engage with, when we say Christian morality, that can reflect any number of beliefs. It can reflect homophobia as much as it can reflect acceptance and tolerance. It can reflect condemning the Crusades as well as supporting the Crusades. We're left with an internal system that can't actually cohesively support specific principles. And so ultimately, what we're going to hear from the Christian Union tonight is more so going to be a reflection of the debaters as individuals, as our side will be reflecting largely who we are as individuals. And when that happens, we have to ask ourselves the most important question. Why should I believe this person? Why should I believe the Pope over the Mormon prophet? Why should I believe any religious authority over a non-religious authority? And I think that ultimately what we'll find out is that it's going to be a process of looking beyond theological belief to understanding the outcomes of these principles, to understanding the effects that they have on our lives, which ultimately will be a form of secular morality. Okay, we have a lot of ground to cover, so I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. All right. Can you hear me? Fantastic. Well, good evening, everyone. It's great that so many of you could join us this evening. Now, the question before us is Christian morality better than secular morality? Now, Pat's begun this evening with some definitions. He said Christian morality is moral reasoning that follows the example of Jesus Christ. And secular morality is any moral reasoning that exists independent of God. Using the requirements of a moral framework, values, duties, and accountability, Pat's quickly introduced us to Christian morality and showed that it provides a good foundation for morality. In a moment, I'll establish our second contention, that secular morality by itself provides no foundation for morality. But first, I want to quickly respond to the previous opposition speaker. Now, I won't have time to respond to every single piece of argument, and we'll do that later. But I do want to respond to what I believe is a false underlying assumption in the opposition's case. Now, the opposition said that Christianity doesn't support a specific morality. He cited the Crusades, he cited homophobia. I just want to ask you, how do we evaluate a musical piece? Now, this makes sense, just follow with me. We base it on the piece, not the performer. If I screw up Beethoven's Für Elise, that doesn't say anything bad about Beethoven, does it? No, it says that I screwed it up. And in the same way, Christian morality says that Jesus Christ lived out a perfect moral life, and therefore we base our morality on Jesus Christ and not on our own actions. Let's be honest, we all screw up quite often. How can we base it on imperfect humans? But now I want to turn to our second contention. But before I do, and as I do, I want to tell you a bit of a story. Allow me to introduce you to Carolyn Fleur-Lobban, a cultural anthropologist who worked in Africa during the 90s. In an article published in 1995, she recounts how she was immediately confronted by crimes against women, female genital mutilation, honor killings, domestic violence. Despite her stance against moral absolutes and her training to not make value judgments about cultural differences, Carolyn voiced her concerns to the African authorities. In her article, she gives their response. You say that all moral values are based on either evolutionary biology or they are culturally constructed. And on the basis of your own belief, it is completely inconsistent for you to say that the way we treat women here is wrong. When you simply present these things as self-evidently true, then you're being just the same white Western imperialist you have always been. Carolyn writes, what authority do we Westerners have to impose our own concept of universal rights on the rest of humanity? The relativist argument she had always employed was now being used to defend human rights violations. Her own moral framework had become the very weapon of oppression she was battling. I think this story demonstrates the inadequacy of secularism as a foundation for our morality. Carolyn believes in human rights, yet under secularism, she admits she has no right to do so. So as we go on to consider secularism tonight, ask yourself these questions. Do your moral beliefs align with secularism? What is the foundation for your morality? Now, we believe that secularism provides no foundation for the values, duties, and accountability that we all believe in. So let's begin with moral values, beliefs about good and evil. How do we derive moral values from a universe which contains at bottom no purpose, no design, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference? While secular morality maintains that moral values are derived through biological evolution and cultural construction. Morality is those actions that help us to perpetuate our species. But this does nothing to prove that certain actions are morally good or evil. Under secularism, how are you and I intrinsically valuable? We're just a clump of cells. We're no more valuable than a rat. A little girl dying is no different to a fish that's been plucked out of water. Now, none of this is consistent with my worldview, but nor do I think it is with yours. If that's the case, where are you drawing your moral values from? Secondly, moral duties, the application of moral values to other people. Do objective moral duties exist within secular morality? Let's imagine for a moment that Pat routinely cheats on his girlfriend. For me to tell him that's wrong requires the existence of objective moral duties and Pat to actually have a girlfriend. But here's 3 ways that secularism tries to ground objective moral duties: in evolution, in social consensus, and in intuition. Firstly, you can say that moral values are objective because they come from evolution. Evolution has programmed us to be monogamous, so Pat is wrong to cheat on his girlfriend. But while evolution can explain the existence of moral values, it does nothing to show that Pat cheating on his girlfriend is actually wrong. A certain behaviour may have helped my ancestors to survive, but that's no reason why I'm obliged to do it. Secondly, you can say that moral values are objective because they come from social consensus. Pat is wrong because we as a society say that cheating is wrong. But how is that objective? 500 years ago, slavery was a social consensus. In some cultures, as I've shown, female genital mutilation is social consensus. This isn't a foundation for objective duties. But I think most of you might fall into this third category. Cheating is just wrong. We all know it. But what if Pat disagrees? Clearly, we don't all know it. My subjective moral intuition is clashing with Pat's subjective moral intuition. And so by definition, duties are not objective. As we see, secularism cannot provide objective duties. So where are you drawing your moral duties from? Finally, moral accountability, the consequences of your actions. If God does not exist, there is no basis for moral accountability. Even if there were objective moral values and duties within secular morality, they seem to be irrelevant. Because if life ends at the grave, it ultimately makes no difference whether you lived as a Stalin or as a Martin Luther King Jr. So what do you say to someone who thinks that they can live as they please? You might say, it's in our best self-interest to adopt a moral lifestyle. But clearly that's not true. Morality often runs perpendicular to self-interest. As historian Stuart Easton writes, there is no objective reason why man should be moral unless morality pays off in his social life or makes him feel good. If secular morality has no accountability, why does it matter how you live? Secularism is inconsistent with your values. It provides no basis for objective duties and no means for accountability. You need all three. You believe in all three, but you can't get them from secularism. And as I finish up, I want to touch on one final fundamental question. Who is Jesus? Even if you disagree and reject him, that relies on you having some sort of understanding about who he is. So who do you think Jesus is, and where did that come from? Perhaps it comes from what you've heard at school. Maybe it's come from how Christians have acted, how you've even been mistreated or marginalized by Christians. But the only way to know Jesus is by looking at him, not imperfect reflections of him. We know Jesus is good, not just because he says so, but because he actively demonstrates it. Jesus dedicated his life to loving others, often at a cost to himself, and ultimately, while the world rejected and ridiculed him, Jesus demonstrated his goodness when he laid his life down for all of us. Christian morality isn't a set of unattainable standards imposed by an impersonal and distant God. No, it's founded upon a good God, a God who deeply loves us. What is secular morality founded on? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't need my pen. All right. Hello. Hi. Yes. Okay. I am audible. I will start. So firstly, I just want to say secularism does not imply moral relativism, and I will get to more of those points that were made perhaps in the cross-examinations, because there's a lot I'd like to also get through. Our capacity for moral knowledge can be adequately explained in historical terms, adverting to a combination of biological evolution, but also cultural overlay. Perhaps we can say that our capacity to arrive at mathematical knowledge and our capacity to arrive at moral knowledge can fit into the very same explanatory framework. To argue about what belongs to culture and what belongs to nature is a whole topic of its own. And it's a very long period, hundreds of thousands of years, over which whatever was there 7 million years ago, when the common ancestor of chimps and humans, or whatever it had, But the difference between chimps and humans now is fairly significant. So a combination of biological, cultural, and social evolution has obviously made a lot of difference. Most of what we see in religion was at one time secular morality purely. And it was incorporated into religion because it was obviously sensible to do that. So the view that secularists are somehow borrowing their morality from religion historically is not the case. It's the other way around. It's not clear how far back religion goes, but you find primates' behavior that's kind of proto-moral, and they don't have religion. These proto-morals, going back 6 or 7 million years, the kind of very primitive moral behavior that you see in chimpanzees is way older than 200,000 years. And this has been demonstrated in many animal behavioral studies. It's clear that there are behaviors that chimps exhibit which to us seem to be expressing concerns about fairness. So it's a pretty fair bet that moralities are much older than religion is, and that although it's kind of changed various ways over time, there's a lot of aspects of it that hasn't changed. It would have always been the case that it was wrong to kill and steal and lie and cheat, etc. But why? So if it wasn't for these basic morals to not kill, to not lie, it's hard to see how our common ancestors would have been successful as small bands of cooperating individuals if they could just kill at their own desire. They would have had prescriptions on doing things like that because otherwise they wouldn't have survived. Society as we know it would not exist. We wouldn't have society in that case. So it's a kind of inference to the best explanation. And societies get bigger and more complicated, and you still have the same difficulties. If a group has internal conflict, that group is vulnerable to attack. So it's not going to be that we have societies where everybody thinks it's just fine to wipe out neighbors if they feel like it, or take a stab at their neighbor if they're annoyed with them, or take a stab at someone who chews their food a bit loudly. But, these things go back 200,000 years before Christianity or the Abrahamic religions, and perhaps even longer. There's still research regarding this. So there are a whole range of meta-ethical theories and positions, but for the purposes of this debate, we will argue from a position of accepting objective morality, from a position of moral realism. Religious views are at a big disadvantage if we shift away from moral realism, so we're quite happy to accept moral truths for the purposes of moving the discussion forward. There are, of course, safety nets for secularism and retreating to other meta-ethical positions, which theism doesn't have, but that's all I will say with regard to that. Moral realism is the view that there are facts of the matter about which actions are right and which are wrong, and about which things are good and which are bad. These are independent of any beliefs, thoughts, cultures, whether everyone in this room thinks it's right when it's not morally. So it's sort of like we cannot make these actions right by agreeing that they are, any more than we can make 2 + 2 = 5 by agreeing that it is. So I just want to give an example. For example, with regard to normative concepts of morality, let's say that things are, as I suppose, that there are moral facts. What should we suppose is the metaphysical status of these moral facts? In particular, should we suppose that there is something else upon which these moral facts depend? Moral realism says they are not. Given that there are such moral truths, the most plausible view is that those moral truths are necessary truths. To give an example, because sometimes these things are better demonstrated in examples, if it is morally wrong to torture children for fun, then it is necessarily true that it is morally wrong to torture children for fun. And if it is necessarily true that it is morally wrong to torture children for fun, then it is true no matter what. If it is true no matter what that it is morally wrong to torture children for fun, then there is nothing that the fact that it is morally wrong to torture children for fun depends on. Hope you kept up. So the claim that there is nothing that the fact that is morally wrong to torture children, it's a metaphysical claim. It's morally wrong, and in all possible worlds. Another argument that we will go for is the Euthyphro dilemma. Some theists say that ethics cannot do without religion because the very meaning of good is nothing other than what God approves, that God is the source of morality. Now, Plato refuted a similar claim more than 2,000 years ago in what is depicted in his Euthyphro dilemma, and the dilemma goes like this. Are things A good because God says that they're good? Or B, does God say that things are good because they are good? If it's the case of A, if the good comes from God, then to do what God wants is merely based on God's opinion. This divine opinion is inherently arbitrary. If God had happened to approve of torture and disapprove of helping our neighbors, torture would have been good and helping our neighbors bad relative to God. If it's B, if God wants us to do the good things because they are good, then we can say that the good is independent of God. It doesn't depend on God. So the proposition that God is the source of morality falls apart. There is no significant way in which morality is especially dependent upon God. Some Christian theists have attempted to get out of this type of dilemma by asserting that God is good and so could not possibly approve of torture and approve of murder. But if you say that, then if you assert this now, you have to explain what you possibly mean by the assertion that God is good. Is God approved of by God? Is God's goodness approved of God being good? There's a logical inconsistency. Ultimately, if the opposition want to claim that Christian morality is better than secular morality, but their distinct moral principles are no different than the moral principles put forward by a secular moral system, then we want to take the position of Christian morality is no better than secular morality because it's largely identical to it. Thank you.
Thanks very much to all of our speakers. That was very, very interesting. So we're now beginning the cross-examination part of the evening. So this consists, we're going to do one set of cross-examination now, then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to do another set of cross-examinations. So each set of cross-examinations consists of 4 instances of 6-minute blocks. Now, bear with me. So 2 blocks for MCU and 2 for MPS. So as MCU went first, as they're the affirmative, the first cross-examination block will be begun by MPS. The idea is that each speaker has a minute to ask the opposing side a question or a clarification, and then the other side has a minute to respond. And it goes back and forth for 6 minutes, with me tapping at 30 seconds, double tapping at a minute, and then calling that speaker off after a minute and 10 seconds. Are you following? There's a lot. We go back and forth for 6 minutes, and then we start the next tranche, right? The next set, the next block. As moderator, it's my duty to ensure that this part of the evening proceeds with civility. So in my time as a philosopher, I've learnt that reasonable and indeed intelligent people can reasonably and intelligently disagree, and they tend to do so over the most important matters for human beings, right? So I would ask all debaters to keep that in mind. The fact of disagreement in no way ought to undermine the dignity of your interlocutor, right? So as I said, because MCU... Oh, MCU... Okay, I'm sorry about that. Sorry, Pat. Take it away.
This one's quite poor. We're going to swap it out. Thanks for that, Josh. Yeah, good evening, guys. I didn't get a chance to say it in my speech, but yeah, welcome. I'm glad you've all come. Thank you to our opposition. Yeah, we really appreciated what we think are actually quite well-reasoned arguments you've presented. We detected probably two major arguments. In the first one, that being that Christianity has no unique moral contribution. The second being that on what basis can you make this authority claim? But in this first block, I think I just want to start by clarifying your position. So I heard in your second statement what I thought were two groundings of objective moral values, and I'm glad you guys agree that moral values do exist objectively. But the two groundings I heard were, one, it's formed by biological and cultural evolution. So biological forces and the culture that we're in, it shapes our morality. But the second I thought was quite different. It was moral realism, that there are morals that exist independent of culture. So I'd like to ask the question firstly, which one is it? How do we get our morals? Are they from evolution and culture, or do they objectively exist?
So it's a good question. It's a good question. And as I said, what comes from nature, what comes from culture, this is a hard question. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions, if we're talking about the proto-morals that I mentioned, that we see in other primates or non-human species. But we want to say that we can arrive at these objective morals, if you like, through reason that has come about through our evolution as a complex social species, and that these objective morals can be based on necessary truths, and those necessary truths are truths that are not dependent on any other claims, as much as perhaps you could say that for your side of moral realism. Yes.
Thank you. So it seems to me that you've maintained both. It's both biological and cultural evolution, but we've arrived at an understanding of what they are. I don't think that those two can coexist. Here's why. If it's from biological evolution, you might say that these are values we have, but on what basis can you say they are right or wrong? Where does the duty come from? I can say that, as Ben argued, we have these values, but if I disagree, why should I follow what my ancestors did? And so if we'd also evolved differently, let's say that the climate of the Earth had been 20 degrees hotter, we'd have evolved a more similar biology to bees. Would it then be right to act as bees do? Would it be right for me as a drone to be killing someone else, or the queen bee to be killing her female children? If we had evolved differently, would our morals be the same? I'll leave it there.
So to clarify, the reason why they're connected is the same reason why, for instance, we can gain more mathematical knowledge. Mathematical knowledge precedes us, but as we progress biologically, we're able to access those truths more and more clearly. So they are connected, and they're connected because moral realist principles exist before we're able to necessarily access them. To the second question of whether or not we would behave differently if we were different, well, sure, but we aren't different. And ultimately, we are not bees. And so although we are adhering, even if we were bees, to the same moral realist principles, we might have different motivations, and we might have different tensions in achieving those principles.
Yeah, okay, I am. Cool. So you said that mathematics, you kind of said that mathematics is similar to morality in the sense that we sort of like discover it, and through evolution, we, like mathematics, we're learning more things, Pythagoras theorem, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is logically inconsistent, because mathematics, yes, we continue to discover more about mathematics each and every year, but mathematics isn't different in different cultures. So in the same way that I brought up female genital mutilation happening in Africa, that is clearly very different to our culture. So you're making the claim that mathematics is the same to morality, but mathematics is consistent throughout all cultures. Morality is not. and yet you claim there is an objective morality. How do you sort that out?
We're not claiming that objective morality isn't consistent throughout different cultures. The perhaps sort of analogy we could have there is that just as 2 + 2 = 5, it's not something that exists in the real world. It's a priori knowledge. And just as that is possible in all possible worlds, whether we disagree that it is, by the same argument, we can say there are moral truths that exist out of necessary truths that will be necessary in all possible worlds. And we're not saying that in our position of morality, we're not saying that we're not arguing for a relativistic morality. We're saying that it's going to be objective and it's not going to be dependent on what different cultures say is right or wrong. There are necessary truths.
So you've asserted that female genital mutilation is wrong, and yet why? You say it's a necessary truth. You say that torturing a child is wrong because torturing a child is wrong. That seems circular to me. On what basis do you assert that female genital mutilation is wrong?
Yes, so these can come down to simple principles like reducing harm and maximizing goodness. You do not have to appeal to anything other than this to posit your own framework of morality. But by same way of argument, we could ask a question to you as well. If we say that there are these necessary truths, these moral codes that exist out of necessary truths, then these, even if we do not have knowledge of them, they will still exist, even if, there's this bottle on my table, then even if I disagree that it's there, or even if most of the people in here that disagree it's there, it is there, we could say, and we want to ground that there are necessary truths of moral truths that are just as that exist just in the same way.
So I think I can summarize for the audience. Moral truths exist. You can assert them. They're just facts. But so if I disagree with someone that this suffering of people is a moral truth and you just assert it, if I disagree with someone, how do we resolve that? The only solution is I'll punch you because I think I'm right. Like we can ground the reason why female genital mutilation is wrong, and I hope you'll ask us why we think that. But under secularism, I fail to see how it is wrong. You've simply asserted it as something that we know. But if I disagree with if someone from a different culture disagrees, where are we left? So I'll finish with a question that I hope you'll answer. If it is grounded in cultural progress, if morals do come from a culture and from evolution, on what basis could you say to someone 500 years ago, racism is wrong? That being their moral truth that it's all right, there are certain races that should be enslaved, because they would have asserted that as just something you know.
That's why we are holding the position of moral realism. So if it was moral relativism, and you go back 500 years, and there are cultures, or even today, that hold those discriminatory views, then okay, perhaps on a moral, relativistic sort of framework, that's what they may have thought was right at that time. But we're not arguing that. We're saying that there are objective moral truths that no matter, even if it was not agreed upon by a majority of a culture 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, however many years ago, we're saying that these exist, and that So yes, the framework we're arguing for is not relativistic.
Just happened to detect these now, and now we're right. I'm wondering how you can justify that our position now is right. Like if 500 years in the future we developed more. I understand your point about moral realism, but I think the problem is you do say morals just exist, but how do you know what is right? Again, your example I feel was circular. Torture is wrong because it's wrong. Well, who says? Who says? So I'll put the question back on you. How do we know these are the right ones?
So, with regard to the sort of thing we posited in like the cultural revolution, evolution, biological evolution, social evolution, is that through this that humans were able to developed this capacity for reasoning, and with reasoning, then if you go back so many like thousands of years, when I discussed with proto-morals, like if you thought that torturing whenever you wished was right, and if you thought that killing whenever you wished was right, you would have been excluded from the group, and that would have affected group cohesion, and that would have affected the group's ability to survive. So these are just the proto-morals, the very basic primitive morals that we're saying.
I might just say, we've kind of used 2 blocks already.
Yeah.
So yeah. No, I wanted to keep the discussion going on this topic. That's really good. I might just give MCU 1 last minute to respond to that, and then MPS can introduce a new topic for the next block, or perhaps 2 blocks, depending on how things go.
Yeah, so maybe a good example that we can work through is one that works in an evolutionary way, but hopefully we all agree is quite morally abhorrent. So the example I want to use is euthanizing disabled people. I think evolutionary, that would be socially advantageous for our society. We're devoting utility towards them, capital. So it might just be, it's just easier to, I don't want to say get rid of them, that's a bit rude. But they have intrinsic value. So we agree that, yeah, we should look after them and we should allow them to have a good life. So how do you reconcile that evolution says that we should probably euthanize disabled people, and yet your moral realism, the objective morals that you assert, say that we shouldn't?
So that really does begin another line. Of course. That really does begin another line of questioning. So I'll leave it up to MPS if you'd like to respond to that question or begin another line of discussion.
Yeah, so to come back to it, yeah. Can you repeat the question? I lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry.
We've got the example of euthanizing disabled people from an evolutionary perspective. That's socially advantageous. We should do it. From a moral realism perspective, we shouldn't.
Well, to be purely practical, there are scales to this. So obviously, we could say the same thing about people 500 years ago contracting a form of cold or a plague or something. Ultimately, in the long term, societies are better when we learn how to adjust for and solve problems of all people. So the medical advancements of trying to basically cure the common cold have resulted in long-term benefits for societies. So it's actually not evolutionarily justified to suggest euthanizing disabled people. It's actually very clearly reflected in the progress of science and medicine that societies are better when we try to adjust off of those disabilities and try and support those people. We get lots of scientific advancements from it.
To clarify, so when will our block of questioning end and theirs begin? I think we've changed up the format a little bit.
Yes, so I was hoping that the last contribution over here would be a kind of sum up, but it actually started a new line of questioning around euthanasia, which is perfectly legitimate and also opens a huge and difficult can of worms. So how I think we might proceed is say that we've got 2 blocks remaining, right? Actually, that's not quite fair because then you would be initiating 2 blocks and they would only be initiating 1. Let's just say before the break, we'll allow MPS to start a fresh block of 6 minutes of discussion on a topic of their choosing. We'll work through that, then we'll take intermission and we'll talk about how to proceed after the break. Great. Over to you, MPS.
Yes. So in your opening statements, you said that it is that without moral accountability after death, that our exercise of moralities would be meaningless. Would you then go on to say that this idea of retributive justice, of the reward and punishment, is the sole thing that guides your moral actions?
I reject the premise. No. I'm just curious where this idea of retributive justice, reward, that being the sole motivator. I understand what you're getting at. If there's something that happens after death, I think that's what you're talking about, is that what motivates us? And I think the implied question is, well, if that is, surely that's not moral. You're just acting in your self-interest. And I think I alluded to this in my opening statement. We're not saved by what we do. Right, in Christianity, as I said, Christians, non-Christians, we've all sinned. We've all, missed the mark, right? And so you're not doing this to achieve some future state. You're doing this because you could say you are so grateful for what Christ has done. If you have a relationship with someone, I suppose, imagine a marriage, right? There's things you do because you love the person. You flush the toilet or whatever. You clean the dishes. You can look at these as rules. But I think it's a far more accurate picture to talk about this as a joyful, loving relationship you're part of. So I don't think that the reason Christians do good is for self-interest in the afterlife.
If that's the case, then why do you put moral accountability explicitly, reward and punishment? The idea that in order for a moral framework to work, it has to have moral accountability, if what you're saying is that it's not the motivator and it's not particularly even relevant to why you behave in a morally good way.
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, you're paying attention. It was a very astute question. I think if you consider the inverse, right, there is no moral accountability. I think it's most clear when you talk about, let's say you're looking at someone else. Right, so someone, let's go back to it. Someone punches me in the face, right? If there isn't actually a judge, some sense of accountability, then I can maintain good morals. I know what I'm going to do and I'm going to stick to that. But in a society, right, where is the recourse? Maybe the only recourse is I punch them back in the face, right? And particularly, as I said, under Christianity, you do have a good sense of justice. I don't think just thinking about it as retributive justice is quite the right way of thinking about it. But I think you can see that in any society where there's more than one person, you do need a judge. You can't just have laws, right? We have police, we have judges as well. Otherwise, the laws are powerless.
So the reason we brought that up is because you said that what makes a moral framework better than another moral framework, and you pointed to values, duties, and accountability. And then you said that, correct me if I'm wrong, that all of what we do is meaningless if there is no accountability after death. So that's why we posited the question that, is it merely because that there is some accountability following death that guides your moral course of action?
I'm not sure if we'd say it's not meaningless, but I would say that if you take away moral accountability, you lose motivation to live morally. You lose the ability to, like if I do a bad action, there's nothing stopping me. So I can do whatever I want. And I think the idea of Christian moral justice is tried to be reflected by in secular world through the justice system, through police. Obviously, it's going to be imperfect because it's humans doing it. But we also have to remember that these are not universal in the sense that if I exist outside of that moral justice system, like I don't know Kim Jong-un, he creates the moral justice system. Like what reason do I have to live morally, to live good, or to live in a selfish way that I desire?
So all of these things we also have under secular moral systems. What makes your moral system distinct to other, let's say, religious moral principles, but also what makes it better than secular moral systems? Because if in secular morality, you can still have your actions, still have accountability, and there are still, as we said, we're accepting objective morals. There are goods and bads and rights and wrongs, and these aren't depending on reward and punishment. And perhaps if one only acts out of reward and punishment, then that maybe seems inherently not so moral to act in such ways.
One last comment from MCU and we'll wrap it up. 1 minute. Great.
I really appreciate that question. So why is Christian morality better in the sphere of accountability than secular morality? Let's go back to that Kim Jong-un example, right? He's probably going to live out his life, have a great time. He's enjoying things. He's oppressing people. I shouldn't be smiling because it's awful and terrible, but ultimately there's no consequences for him, right? Under secularism. Now, we're here tonight talking about what is the best system, and the way we've approached it is, can you really live it out, right? If you're asserting certain principles that say, well, there's accountability sometimes if I get caught, that's actually not as good a moral framework as there is accountability. It's not, and it's not just the fact that for everyone, everyone dies eventually. It's also the fact that who is the judge, right? Is it a human imperfect judge who maybe is biased against me, or is it someone who I know is just, I know has my best interest in mind because he died for me, I know who loves me, someone who knows everything. Now, I assert that is a far better judge, far better accountability, better than limited imperfect justice in this line.
Great. Please join me in giving our debaters a warm round of applause.
Four minutes behind schedule. That's pretty good. So we will now be taking a brief 10-minute intermission, mainly to allow Gene to rest his knuckles. So we'll be back at 7:30 sharp, ready to continue the debate.
So to start off, just sort of to clarify, what is it that you think is unique about Christian morality?
Apologies. Oh, it's right in front of me. Yeah, so we detected one of your arguments was that Christianity has no unique contribution. You said, for example, that golden rule, love your neighbour, that's present everywhere. For those of you in the audience with a phone, you're allowed to do this now if you want. You can pull out your phone, you can go on Wikipedia and search golden rule. There's a whole page for it. And there's this section of pre-Christian golden rule, which is, love your neighbour. Every single example bar none, is phrased in the negative. It's phrased this way. It's not love your neighbour as yourself. It's don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. It's not do good to others. It's don't do bad to them so that they don't do bad to you. Every single example. And then you get to Jesus and he says, not just love your friends, love your enemies. So I think you can call those ones silver rules, right? Confucianism, Buddhism, there's examples in all of them. Don't hurt others so they don't hurt you. But I think you can say that is a unique contribution. That does not come around until Christ. And he proved it. He died for his enemies.
So you feel that there's something particularly, you think that having it in the active and in the positive changes it because it enjoins you to sort of do actively good things?
Partially. I think partially it takes the onus off the selfish part of doing it. I might not hit Pat simply because I don't want him to hit me, rather than I choose not to hit Pat because I know that Pat won't hit me. And I think the idea of love your enemies, that's the unique thing about Christianity. Yes, we can talk about the different phrasing of the golden rule, but we also need to draw our attention to love your enemy. I think that's where potentially we can continue this discussion.
Can't you love your enemies without Christ?
Yes, as we said at the start, yeah, atheists can do good. You can be a secularist and you can have that belief system and then still do things that are out of sync with that belief system, definitely.
So what is unique about Christian morality?
So I have two things. The one that I'm referring to, so I'll get back to the golden rule and then I'll move on to the second one. So the golden rule, just because someone can do something because they're secular doesn't mean it's in secularism. So I would say that if someone really did follow a secular worldview, they wouldn't love their enemies. It's not beneficial for a chimp in the wild to be taking care of a chimp from a neighbouring tribe. That's its competitor. If it sees it injured on the ground, it should, by all rights, kill it. So a golden rule is actually something that's unique to Christianity. Even though you can follow those actions, it's not enforced by secularism. It's not given as a value. And the second that I'll give is in Christianity, you actually do have objectivism. That is a unique contribution compared with secularism. Maybe not compared with other monotheistic religions, but that's not the topic tonight. Christianity versus secularism, morals. So I think Christian objectivism is unique. I think we've shown tonight that secularism fails to ground things objectively.
Well, I guess that's a good segue into how you feel Christian morals are justified, how they're not circular.
Well, you guys brought up euthyphro. Yeah, so we can jump into that if you'd like. So our claim here, let me see if I can find my notes, because I was really interested by this, to be honest. We would say that God is both supremely good and the ultimate standard of good. And yes, you would say that is circulatory, but it isn't narrowly circulatory like secularism is. The biblical writers never said that God is good because he says he is good, and because he says he is good, he is good. No, we believe that God is good not just because he tells us that he is good, but because he actively demonstrates it. And I think we need to remember that secularism also relies on this circulatory argument as well. If you're saying that something is good, what sort of independent goodness are you referring to?
So are you saying that goodness is independent of God, or are you saying goodness is God?
No. So maybe it'll be helpful if I go through the euthyphro argument and I'll just say it how Plato wrote it. So he says, is it whether, where is it? Yeah, is it good because the gods say it is good, or whether God commands good because of its intrinsic nature? So the first one being good's arbitrary. So God could say one thing one day and one thing the other day, but God's word is not arbitrary. God commends goodness to us because he himself is supremely good. So he cannot commend something that is not good because that goes against his nature. And the second one I think is a little bit more targeted to what you're asking. You're saying goodness, could it be independent? If goodness is independent to God, then God is subordinate to that goodness. And I think we need to remember that goodness is not an abstract concept. And in the same way that we just have to, I guess we have to remember that the behavior of a human can't be the criterion of goodness, but an attribute of God can be. So we need to remember that goodness isn't an abstract concept, but it's a behavior and self-revelation of a personal God.
So that's also circular. You're saying that God is good because God is good. If that's the case, then goodness precedes God. And if that's the case, then goodness is independent to God.
Yep, so firstly, goodness precedes God. If God is eternal and goodness is God's nature, then God and goodness have just existed together because goodness is in God's nature forever. Yes, and I did say that Christianity and the idea that God is good is circulatory, and I agree with that. And I think it's broadly circulatory because God says he is good, but he also demonstrates it. And I want maybe give an example of how secularism also relies on that circulatory argument. So if you try to prove that goodness is an abstract form, we need to firstly derive morality from that, and then we need to show that that morality is actually good in itself. But if your abstract standard is the supreme standard, then you must show that the content of the abstract form to be good must be in reference to the abstract form. I don't know if that made any sense. But the sense is, if you've got goodness up here and it's abstract, it's independent, and we derive morality from that and say that morality is good, we then need to say, well, that independence is good. And it's, again, a circle. But different to Christianity, it's not personal and it can't demonstrate it.
Okay, so if we're saying that God is good, and even if we're saying that goodness is simply an attribute of God, we're just saying that God and goodness have always existed alongside each other. Why is it meaningful to say that God is good? Aren't we simply saying that God is and does as God is and does? What does it mean truly to say that God is good if all it is saying that God behaves how he wants to?
I think in one sense, it's always going to sound circular. In fact, we're here tonight really looking at a circular sounding topic. Christian morality, better, secular morality, better. Better is kind of a moral word anyway. So we've looked at this topic through another lens with, I think, a livability angle. Does it have the values, duties, accountability? Like, can you actually live it out? I think that is another way of saying that something is good. But I think I'll just maybe reiterate what Ben said, and he's doing PPE, so he's a smart philosopher. Broad and narrow circularity. Christianity, narrow circularity for secularism, meaning that it's just asserted. Torture is wrong because torture is wrong, and that's really the only reason why it's wrong. It just exists. Broad circularity, I think the point Ben was making is God shows it. Goodness as a quality proceeds from God, and he's actually shown it. So there's a reason for it in Jesus Christ in particular.
Just quickly to interject, we've been talking about this topic now, as far as I can see, we've had 14 back and forths. It's very hard to keep track. What I might do is just ask for kind of closing submissions, essentially, from both sides on this particular topic about circularity and the youth vote problem, and then we'll allow MCU to introduce another topic for debate.
For you to say that, again, the circular argument of God is good because its goodness is in God's nature is the same as us saying that certain things are good because they are necessarily good, because they're bound to necessary truth. If God's goodness, it being good, is a necessary truth, we can equally say that these moral codes that we have as necessary truths are necessary truths without relying on any other metaphysical claim. And if you say that God is perfect, then we can also say, then why is there imperfection in the world? Why is there evil or suffering in the the world, and how could it be that perfection gives rise to imperfection? And if God existed in a state of perfection before creation, why diverge away from that?
Chat about that later. I would just say that this idea of goodness, like we're always going to be in a tussle about this. You're saying that it comes from a necessary morality, but I don't see the foundation or the grounding for that. We've said that God's goodness is broadly circulatory, and I would say I think we're making the claim that secular morality or necessary, I think it'll just be secular morality is narrowly circulatory.
So one is not superior to the other. They are the same.
Well, one is broadly, one is narrowly. Secular morality cannot demonstrate what goodness looks like. And
Neither can God's being good demonstrate what goodness is.
Well, but you see, when you say good, it's not grounded in anything. When we say good, it's grounded in, obviously, God.
And that's circulatory.
Yes, and so is yours.
So one is not superior to the other.
So we've reached the point where... Okay. I hope that clap is for the... for the debaters, because that was excellent. So we've reached the point that circulatoriness is bad, and either one is circular, and whoever it proves to be circular will be bad in the narrow sense. But we'll leave that for you to decide. This is the last of our set of cross-examinations. It's for the MCU to introduce a topic or question that they would like debated back and forth 12 times, or more if required.
So we talked a little bit earlier about, a lot about it. What is the foundation for these moral, real values? You say they're objective. What's the foundation? But I want to get a bit towards the so what. Why are we making such a big deal about the fact that it's grounded in, or secularism says it's grounded in evolution and culture? Why is that a big issue? Well, it's because if you think that moral values, they exist from evolution and culture and you can just know them, then what you see arising is this really dangerous moral reasoning where if I believe something is true, that is actually a valid reason for me to enforce it. I don't need any external authority. It can come straight from me. And to give you an example of this dangerous line of reasoning, I'm going to bring up someone who was actually invited to Monash Philosophy Society's a talk last year, Peter Singer. Peter Singer is a philosopher. He's a utilitarian philosopher, which I think it matches quite well with the idea that these guys were bringing up about minimizing suffering, maximizing good. And I'll get back to the quote because my time's up, but I'll probably just ask the first question. This idea of utilitarianism, maximum, because you said minimizing suffering, would you say that is a good example of a secular morality?
We're not, in saying that, we're not arguing for utilitarianism. We said at the start, we're arguing for moral realism. That was just a way of explaining how we can judge whether something is a good or bad in the how much like if it's a harmful thing or if it's something that produces good, or so we're not tying that back to utilitarianism. We're still arguing for moral realism, objective morality.
So to my eyes, it sounds like you're not arguing for it, for utilitarianism, but still sort of using these sorts of ideas, minimizing suffering. I won't say that you guys are trying to defend utilitarianism, but I'll give that as an example of a secular morality. Utilitarianism is the belief that morals should come from what minimizes suffering, what maximizes happiness. And that's a human concept, right? I can reason out morals myself. I don't need an objective standard outside of humanity. We can figure it out ourselves. Let me give you an example as to why I think this is dangerous moral reasoning. I'm going to read a quote from Peter Singer. It's from his FAQs on his website. You can Google it. It's about halfway down. And I think it's quite in line with secularism, trying to minimize suffering. Peter Singer. I think that it is generally a greater wrong to kill such a being, an infant child, than it is to kill an adult, than it is to kill a being that has no sense of existing over time. Here's the kicker. Newborn human babies have no sense of their own existence in time. So killing a newborn baby is never equivalent to killing a person that is a being who wants to go on living. Now, that doesn't mean it's not always a terrible thing to do. It is, but that is because most infants are loved and cherished by their parents. And to kill an infant is usually to do a great wrong to his or her parents. I present that as the fruit of secular morality. And I'd ask them, why is that inconsistent?
So I just want to clarify. There are many meta-ethical positions, and different philosophers have different positions on these. We're not arguing for utilitarianism here tonight, so that quote is not relevant to what we are specifically arguing for. We said at the start that we're basing our premise on objective morality and moral realism. So there are many different meta-ethical principles that we can get into. Secularism doesn't mean utilitarianism. Secularism doesn't imply moral relativism. Secularism, there are different meta-ethical claims. We here tonight are positing our position from a moral realism point of view.
I understand that you're not trying to defend utilitarianism, which I think is good. I don't think you can defend it too well. But I think the issue is you can't attack it. Right? We can say on the basis of a Christian framework, actually, killing a newborn infant is intrinsically wrong, even if the parents don't care about it. But I think on secularism, on moral realism, I don't see how you can assert that. You said utilitarian, it's one of many secular moralities. But if yours can't say why the others are wrong, I think that's a real flaw with it. And that alludes to the problem of you get these dangerous ideas that you cannot, in good conscience, say are wrong. So I think the question is, on moral realism, why is this killing newborn infants, if their parents are all right with it, why is that wrong?
I think the issue, first and foremost, with this as sort of a critique is that it's sort of a critique that applies to both frameworks pretty equally. So it may be true that we can't say objectively, here's why this is wrong. Sure, we can provide arguments for why, but ultimately it would be sort of like us posing to you the question, look at all these bad acts or look at all the things that can be rationalized through Christianity as there have been. For instance, when the Crusades were starting, one of the main ways that it was justified was on the basis that because Jesus died for Christians, Christians should die for other Christians in the same way and exist in Jesus's image. It's not really a critique of your position to say that other Christians can disagree or other Christians can come to different conclusions. Ultimately, secularity is an umbrella, just as Christianity is an umbrella, and you're ultimately asking us to respond to something that's much below the umbrella.
I'm glad we're getting back to Christ, because that's what I wanted to bring it back to, because that is the foundation of Christian morality. I think I don't actually agree that we're in the same boat, because when I look at secularism, you say that, well, within the secularist tent, there's lots of different beliefs. How do you know which is the right one? How do you know which is correct? I don't think there's any line of reasoning that you can apply to say this one's right, this one's wrong. Now, Christianity, there is a line of reasoning right there. We presented at the start. If it does not reflect or represent Christ, it's not Christian. So the Crusades, fantastic example. You can point to that and you can say, where did Christ say, I'm going to go and I'm going to kill all my enemies and I'm going to invade this other land? Right? If you look at I'll give another example of wrongdoing by Christian that I would love to get out front and talk about it. Abuse in the church. Where did Christ abuse people? So just because someone justifies something in Jesus' name does not in any way make it Christian. That is the litmus test. That's the standard. Did Christ do it? Whereas I think in secularism, there really is no way of differentiating. Would you like me to end on a question, or you can respond to that? You guys.
Ultimately, we're both in agreement with moral realism tonight. We don't have to point to specific, actions from both sides of wrongdoing. So we could point to wrongdoings. You could point to wrongdoings. That won't get us anywhere. But if we're both in agreement with moral realism, then what makes your moral principle your moral principles more superior to secular moral principles, where we are also agreeing upon moral realism?
Yeah, so you're saying that we both have objective morals, so who can say which one is superior? Valid question. So we've seen that Christian morality is objective, obviously, because it's founded on God, who is good. I feel like we haven't fleshed out, or we began to, but we can continue to flesh out the objectivity of secularism, because you still haven't fleshed out this, relationship between evolution and social construction and the existence of moral realism. So maybe we can go back to, let's go back to Carolyn's example. We would go to that culture and say, what you are doing is wrong. Women have intrinsic value. They are valuable. You are harming them. That is wrong. If you go, as the African authority said, that's just white Western imperialism. How can we do that through secularism without being arrogant, without creating good and bad guys, and without establishing, well, how do I know that my culture has evolved correctly and theirs hasn't?
To again come back to that point of how this what this culture does, is that good or bad, or what that culture does, is that good or bad? That's again touching moral relativism, that that morals are relativistic to cultures or peoples. But by that same argument, we could say, but okay, under Christianity, there are different branches that posit different moral principles. Why one moral principle over another? Why your certain moral principles over other Christian branches of moral principles? If you're going to say that to secularism, then we can point that out to moral Christian principles as well.
But I'm still confused, because you're saying, yeah, cultural construction and biological evolution is morally relative, and we agree with you. But you hold that while also holding moral objectivity. You have to pick one.
Okay, so in the way that you can attribute goodness as a quality to God, you can say that just a quality of God is goodness. That quality can be attributed, for instance, to the universe. It can be just taken as a constant or as a law of the universe. In the same way that you can look at God and go, he's good, therefore what God does is good. We can look at the universe and say there is goodness within the universe. And we can say that as a result of that, we can seek out that goodness. And as we evolve, as we become more intelligent, as we gain more knowledge, we get closer and closer to accessing those truths in their entirety, in the same way that Christianity has improved over time as a result of gaining better interpretations of the Bible, focusing more. I mean, the New Testament is, from the Christian perspective, an improvement on religion on the basis of getting a clearer image of goodness. It's the same for secular.
So I would disagree there in the sense, in the general argument, not that last point. You're saying that morality exists intrinsically just within the universe in the same way that gravity might, or air resistance. The difference between that and Christianity is we can have no way of knowing what the intrinsic morality is in secularism. God makes it clear through revelation. He tells us. How do we determine within our world what the heck is good and bad? Because people in Africa are saying that female genital mutilation is right. They're saying that this is the intrinsic moral value of the world. We're saying it's not. How can we tell who's right?
Well, I think this comes back to the clarification of interpretation. Ultimately, we are trying to seek truths that exist external to us. And our process of seeking those truths is improved upon. But the ultimate reality is that when we talk about crusades, for instance, Jesus said, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. The Crusaders did not bring peace, they brought swords. That's acting in Jesus' image, right? But ultimately, through a period of improving our ability to interpret the Bible or get closer to the maybe effective or best image of Jesus, we improve. It's the same for secular morality. Ultimately, there are existing necessary moral truths, and as time goes on and as we engage with them more, we are more successful at finding them.
Just one thing. When I pointed out those biological, cultural, social proto-morals, it's just to say that these are some basic proto-morals that have existed far, far longer than religions that were there, because if they weren't there, then society as we know it would not have been the way it is today. These have developed over time, and so the argument that I'm saying, that I'm not saying that they're inherently biological, inherently this or inherently that. It's a combination, and that the objective morals that your framework posits is not inherently unique.
Okay, great. So philosophy's had a double, and so MCU can have a double, and that, I think, brings us to the end. We're up to 16 back and forths, right? So, well, you both have an opportunity to speak for a minute now. Yeah.
Three things in that awesome packed response that I'm going to respond to in turn. First one, to the point of Jesus said, I've come to carry a sword. We don't have time to get into it, but my response would be, where does it say that? What's the literary context? What's the historical context? What's the style in which it's being written? Have you studied it? Who's the author? That, obviously, we don't have time to get into it, so hopefully it doesn't come across as a disingenuous question. But the second point, responding to Jenset's last point, yes, talked about these prototypical morals. I disagree. I think you don't see them in nature. Nature is red in tooth and claw. I don't think you could say that loving your enemies is a prototypical moral. I don't see that present at all. And if there is this sense in which, well, we know what right and wrong is internally, well, I think that you do see in humans a moral sense, and I think it's baked into us by God. We're created by a God who is good. And so there is, often we fail to understand it, but there is this intrinsic moral sense. And the final point is you've mentioned the word improve a number of times. Christianity's improved, and we've gotten better at understanding these truths. How on earth can you say there's an improvement? Against what third-party objective standard have we improved? We've got closer to the mark. Well, what's the mark? I don't see how you can say that we've improved as a society under secularism.
And can I just sort of conclude, wrap it up?
1.5, so yeah, 30 seconds or so.
I think we've come to a point in which we've got two runners on a running track. We've got a person who's a Christian and a person who is not. And they both think that there is objective morals, and they're running. And the Christian runner, he knows where he is running to. He knows because God has told him where he is running to. He's told him how he can run to there. secular morality, they're going to just keep running. They don't know where they're running to. They don't know how they can run to that. They have no way of comprehending what moral truth actually is. They don't know when they've reached moral truth, and they don't know how to get there.
Could I say something on that?
Yes.
For
Yes. Sure. 45 seconds. Okay.
Yes. In numerous studies conducting a comparison of religious countries to irreligious countries, the most secular countries were the most stable, peaceful, free, wealthy, and healthy societies in the world.
Can I say something for like 5 seconds?
Sure.
Let's just remember that those secular cultures were built on Christian soil, as you alluded to in your opening statement.
I get one response.
That concludes the cross-examination part of the evening. My knuckles are thankful that it's over. That was incredibly interesting and incredibly hard fought. And well done to all of the debaters putting themselves on the spot like that. I thought they did an incredible job, both sides. And now we're moving over to Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Gene. I very much agree. Well done to all thus far. So this Q&A part of the evening, let me just explain how this will all work to put any doubt out of your minds. So you may have already filled out a question or two, but for those who haven't, the QR code on the screen behind me will take you to a Google form in which you can submit any questions you have. There is an option to stand up and read the question out yourself, in which case I'll be running around with this mic to give you the floor. Otherwise, if you would prefer our very capable representatives in the front row, put up your hands, Hamish and James. Yes, good on them. We'll be able to read it out for you. So on that note, I will hand over to James and Hamish to give us our first question, and I will put on my running boots.
Yeah, just first, as a quick note, I've noticed some of you have submitted multiple questions and said that you're happy to ask them. If we get to that situation and we get around to you, can you just let us know that you've asked multiple questions at that point, and we'll ask you to clarify. We'll ask the clarifying question, or if you don't remember which one it was, we can just read it for you at that point. And that'll just help make things a bit easier. All your questions are great, and we encourage them to ask you outside if they're not answered in here, but we're just after these specific ones being answered right here at the moment.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so our first question comes from Rachel Song.
I'm going.
Yeah. Oh, and this question will be, this question's addressed to MPS.
Hi, well done, everyone. I think you're all very well-spoken and intelligent people. So this is my question for the Philosophy Society. Under the assumption that there is moral realism and that we move closer to that reality, is there a theoretical future of moral perfection?
That's, we don't always have the answers to everything, but as a society that strives for good, and then it's all a process. But what is moral perfection? What is perfection? That's a hard question. We first have to understand what moral perfection is, and then perhaps begin to answer that question.
I think just to sort of expand on that a little bit, The only thing we can really know is progress and improvement. I think it would be highly presumptuous of either of us to speak so authoritatively on what we can really expect to be in our future. But I think that as we've seen historically, and we will continue to see as time progresses, we will get closer to moral perfection, certainly.
So our next question is for Monash Christian Union. It's anonymous. So if our knowledge of the perfect Christ is recorded and spread by imperfect humans, isn't it impossible that we are aware of his perfect teachings? And so we cannot know if Christ did it to determine if something is good?
So I think the theme of the question is historical reliability, referring to. I'd clarify if the person was there, but I think I'm getting to it. Do the Gospels, these 4 biographies about Jesus, actually reflect what he did? Are they accurate? Perhaps there's a misconception that these are texts that were written hundreds of years after the fact by people that weren't there. They've since been translated numerous times, and every time you have a translation, it's less accurate. Not true. Not true at all. The texts that we have today, right here, they were written by eyewitnesses. They were written at the same time as during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses who could confirm or correct. And also, the historical reliability of the New Testament text is unparalleled anywhere else in document scholarship. There's over 5,000 copies or fragments of texts that we're referring to, these 4 Gospels. You look at something like the Julius Caesar's, I'm forgetting it. I forgot what it's called. That's all right. Look at Julius Caesar's writings. Look at Plato's writings. The records that they actually existed are orders of magnitude worse than our records of that Jesus existed, that he did what he said. Leave there. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
So which one's the next one? Yep. All right. Thank you, everyone. So the next question is for the Monash Philosophy Society, and it's from Peter Christie's. Oh, okay. All right. No worries. All right. So Peter asks, we seem to be able to accurately provide a complete physical description of events such as murder. The blade of the knife was X centimeters long. There are 3 stab wounds, etc. However, where do the objective moral properties arise from? They presumably aren't detectable empirically by the senses. So would you maintain that moral properties are physical or natural? And if so, how does that work? And if not, doesn't that point to a reality beyond the physical world grounding the moral properties?
So I think there is an analogy to be made with other sort of universal constants, such as, our conceptions of rationality or things that aren't necessarily physical, but that we recognize them as existing conceptually. And so the same is true of morality. We come to them through the same process as we discover other universal constants. They are present and reflected through, certain phenomena, for instance, and we can evaluate them through basically a process of critical evaluation.
We can be realists about our mathematical and scientific judgments. Why can't we be realists about our moral judgments? Our mathematical scientific judgments don't come from something outside of this world. So why should we posit that our moral judgments come from something out of this world?
Yeah, just bear with us as we both try and collate questions and ask questions. Your patience is appreciated for us. The next question we've got is for Monash Christian Union. Again, no one wants to ask these ones out loud. If God is morally perfect, what would he do in the trolley dilemma?
Wow, I just love that question. I studied the trolley problem for like 6 weeks. It sucks. Great question. I think, actually, I've thought a little bit about this. In terms of if Jesus was the one pulling the lever. So if you didn't know what the trolley problem is, it's a train that's going, it goes off onto 2 tracks. There's one person on one and 5 people on the other. And you're just sort of in the booth and you can decide where the train goes. To be honest, I'm not really sure in that circumstance. I think if you flip the question a little bit and you become the one person that is getting run over and you have the ability to flip it and kill the 5, I think as a Christian, I think Jesus would do the same, is you would sacrifice yourself rather than killing the 5 because you have the hope of eternal life, whereas you don't know what the 5, if they believe in God or not, and you might want to give them the opportunity to discover God's grace. In terms of if you're the one in the booth, I'm not really sure, to be honest.
Okay, so the next question is addressed to both MPS and MCU. In the interest of time, we'll hand it to MPS to answer this question, and to MCU, if you'd like to answer this question as well, we can hand it to you afterward. And this question comes from Emily Guy.
Yep, coming.
So you've talked a lot about genital mutilation in Africa. That's actually something that happens in a lot of different religions. Take Judaism, for example. You don't shame Jewish people for circumcising their sons. So could you say, given that, on the one hand, given that it would be evolutionary beneficial to reduce harm and increase fertility, in a secular morality, it would not have come about. But then could you also say that genital mutilation is a byproduct of the environment which these communities have been subjected to and not an issue of morality at all?
So yeah, I think if you didn't know Jewish culture, they believe in circumcision, and circumcision is like symbolic of the covenant made between people and God. I think you can't draw direct comparisons between female genital mutilation and male circumcision, just in the sense that female genital mutilation is pretty horrific. Like, not only does it decrease, I think it decreases fertility, don't quote me on that, but it also just makes sex really painful and takes away from the enjoyment of it. And that's very different to male circumcision, which, like all the sexual properties remain. I think it's a bit weird, but as Christians, we believe in like enjoying sex as much as it's weird. Sex is a gift. Sex is a gift from God, and He calls us to actually enjoy it. So, like male circumcision doesn't inhibit that, whereas female genital mutilation would. I don't know if you want to add something.
Sorry, I missed the very last part of the question because I think there's another thrust to it. Could you just repeat the last part again?
Let me get it up. I said, so given that it's arisen in so many different religions, just like you shouldn't kill people, that's come up in lots of different religions, could you say that these sort of things are a byproduct of the environments which these communities are subjected to rather than an issue of morality?
These sort of things being
So
circumcision or
just
the
like
moral values?
Those sort of values, like genital mutilation being an example.
Okay, sure. So we see common bad things come up in different cultures. Couldn't the good things also just be something that arises from? Yeah. So I think, and the crux, I think, of this question is, again, it's about the standard by which you're judging any different culture, any different person's values. So under Christianity, you do see something good might arise in some culture, something bad. You can actually make a judgment on that. It's to the extent that it reflects and represents Christ. So you can say, yeah, this particular behavior could be good or bad. And I don't think that's something that's arisen everywhere. That is something that is one time, it's objective, it sort of sits removed from the different cultures, whereas those other bad things that are coming up, even you could even say something that's good, maybe you point to some altruism, you can actually judge that by an external standard. I think that's, so respond to the second thrust of the question.
Yeah, just by the same sort of argument as we've also positioned ourselves from moral realism, then we can say, yes, there may be, environmental, cultural factors that influence what sort of practices different societies have, but from an objective morals moral realism standard, we can evaluate these things more objectively, and it doesn't have to be relativistic to a culture or environment or mental conditioning or whatnot.
Yeah, so our next question is for Monash Christian Union, and it's from Charlie, and he's happy to ask this.
Oh, yep. Hello. So you guys spoke at the Christian Union a lot about the accountability factor of like the viability of a moral groundwork. Given that God being the judge in the Christian morality framework doesn't actually judge based on our actions and judges based on our beliefs, how can you claim that he's actually judging someone's morality at the end of our life?
Yeah, I think we should do that. Hey, Charlie, I can kind of see you off the back. Thanks very much for the question. And I think one thing I like about the Q&As is sort of in this sort of back and forth, it's a bit more combative just by the nature of it's a debate, and that's all right. In the Q&As, there's probably a bit more room to almost let your guard down. And to that question, like it's something that I think a lot of Christians maybe struggle, but find a difficult question to think about, right? Because it's so baked into us that I should do, like I do good, I want to be able to do good, I'm a good person, and that's based on what I do, that when someone comes along and says, actually, your goodness can never be based on what you do, it can only be through what someone else has done, kind of really grates with us. But I think it's one of the things we've alluded to. It is another thing that really makes Christianity unique, because if there is a perfect standard, and we've talked about moral realism, we all, I think here, we agree that there are moral values, and sometimes we transgress them. If there is such a high standard, and I don't live up to it, and I have this ethic that there should be justice, what happens to me? If I want justice for other people, what about justice for the wrong things I've done? And I don't think any religion, or secularism in particular, doesn't have an answer to that. Whereas Christianity, the answer is God loved you so much that he said, I'm going to take the punishment for that. I still want you to have a relationship with me. And look, don't get me wrong, Jesus does judge that. When you read the Bible, read the way Jesus talks, we have to give an account for every word we say, right, before God. So there is accountability for actions, but in the end, the greatest accountability is, did I choose to engage in a relationship with my God, or did I choose to reject him? And God gives us that free will. But the answer to that question really is the highest question in morality. So I hope I've given a reasonable answer to that question. I'll give it over to Ben.
Yeah, I think just it's the idea, if there is moral perfection and none of us attain it, it sets in that reality that we are actually all not good enough, and that we all, in certain times of our life, and quite often as well, we reject God, and we are actually God's enemies. So if we rely on that perfect standard, we are all enemies before God. And Jesus came down came down whilst we were still enemies and died for us so that we might not be enemies anymore. I think we have to remember that that doesn't subvert justice, because the punishment for rejecting God is death and is separation from God. But God doesn't desire that. So God put Jesus in our place. Jesus died the death we were meant to die, and he died the death thinking of all of us who are enemies to him and who rejected and ridiculed him. And I think there's a bit of humility and a bit of beauty to that, thinking that, well, we can't reach that standard, but the God who set that standard loved us so much that he came down and endured our wickedness and endured the ridicule that we, or the rejection that we often do to God. And he brought us back to himself. And I think there's a real beauty in that and a real humility in that.
Thank you, MCU. Our next question is for MPS, and it comes from Don. Yeah, of course, I can read it out. So Don asks, as a secularist, you mentioned that morality needs to be assessed beyond because God said so. However, you also posit that in order to establish superiority, the existence of God must be established. Could you speak to why Christian morality superiority cannot be established on consistency with reality or perhaps intuition?
I didn't posit the view that God is necessary. What I would say is that if you're going to say that God's being good is the necessary truth, and you can't, and that's not based on any other metaphysical claim, we can do the same by saying that there are necessary truths that are, if there are moral truths, there are necessary truths that we also do. We don't need to base on another metaphysical claim. So the difference is one moral framework bases it on God and says God is good because God approves of God being good. Ours says that there is a necessary truth, and that necessary truth is true because it does not depend on any other metaphysical claim.
Well, I did make the claim, so I have to be the one to respond to it. So ultimately, if we're going to say the statement, why is this thing justified? Well, and the response is, well, God said so. There has to be a God that said so. So ultimately, if we're going to use God as a basis for moral judgments, God has to thereby exist. And so ultimately, we can't have Christian morality because ultimately Christian morality is exclusively unique based on its theological principles. And in particular, that a God exists and that a very specific Abrahamic Christian conception of a God exists. So if that's the foundation of all of our morality, it's all of our interactions with morality and moral principles. If we then find out that this God isn't real, or that a different God exists, or that multiple God exists, the foundation of Christian moral justification no longer exists. And thereby it just becomes a form of secular morality, but with certain Christian narratives overlaid on top.
Yeah. So our next question is for Monash Christian Union. Slavery was acceptable in all Christian dominant societies, and the Bible has guidelines for treating slaves. Why isn't slavery still acceptable if Christianity has always allowed it?
Yeah, really good question. Two thrusts to it, I think. First one being behavior of Christians, and then the other one being what we see in the Bible? And don't both of these show that Christianity supports slavery? I think that's the question. To the first point, behavior of Christians, I think, does it reflect or represent Christ? I don't think slavery does. I think what you see Jesus doing is upholding the weak, people who in that culture are lesser. Jesus was not a slave master. And now, obviously, the point is, well, then why would all these Christians do these things? Slavery is certainly not a Christian introduction, something Christians introduced to the world. I think it's a human problem. Humans naturally say, well, I want to dominate, I want to profit off you. And I think where you see Christians doing it that's not because of their Christianity. That's because of their own selfishness. I think we're not here arguing that Christian morality is better than secular morality because Christians did X, Y, Z good thing. But perhaps there's an assumption that Christians didn't do good, never do good things. And I do want to point out, might be helpful, that the abolition of the slave trade in sort of the 1700s, 1800s was instigated by Christian ministers in England, in the British Empire, when they outlawed the slave trade. Even going back to 400s AD, the first people in the world, you can look this up, first people in the world to be really claiming that actually it's wrong to own slaves. They're these sort of Christian bishops in modern day Turkey, and Gregory of Nyssa. And these people who they looked at the Bible and they said, actually, based on what's here, if people have intrinsic value from God, how could I ever pay for a person? Humans have infinite value. So slavery is actually wrong. Now, it took them a while to work that out. I think it's something that's really deeply baked into humans, as there's this desire to dominate. But I think eventually working it out, and Christians did fail, and we should really acknowledge that. We should point to that and say that's wrong. But I think it is not Christian morality. You look at Christ, certainly doesn't represent Christ. And I'll make the response to the second point briefer. What about the Bible? Doesn't the Bible support slavery? When slavery is talked about in the Bible, the word slavery, what it's referring to is something that it's very different to modern chattel slavery. It's far closer to debt bondage, right? I'll give you some characteristics of it. Couldn't own slaves for more than 6 years. They'd go free after 6 years. Someone would often sell themselves into slavery if they were so poor that they didn't have anything to eat. The instructions about treating your slaves or what debt bonded servants, they're pretty strict. If you harm them, they go free. If someone escaped slave comes to you, don't return them to your master, because the master's probably been mistreating them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have escaped. And you actually see explicit commands when it's listing these people that are doing evils, wrongdoings. One of them is man stealers. That's the word that's used. People who kidnap people and make them slaves. So actually, the Bible explicitly condemns slavery. Do you have any response? So I think, it is. Well, it's terrible, and Christians need to be held accountable. It's not in line with Christ or the Bible.
So this, is this working? Yeah. Okay. So this next question is a very interesting one, I find, and it's addressed to both teams. But in the interest of time, we'll hand it to MPS to answer first, and MCU, if you'd like to answer afterward, we can give you the opportunity to do so. And this question comes from Kerry.
Make you go all the way up here. Sorry, this might be a little bit long question, but coming from the theme of the debate, I feel like both teams are sort of arguing for the same thing, but the key difference is between the inherent goodness of God and also in that sort. So I kind of want to change the perspective a little bit. So could both teams argue for argue for the benefits, and also from a more pragmatic and I don't want to say utilitarian, but from a more pragmatic point of view, like in terms of the enforcement of the values you represent, so whether it be Christian values or secular values, like can you argue for enforcing these values in society, so through legislation or law enforcement, that kind of things? Like, just want a clarification on that one, yeah.
So you're right in saying that we are arguing for the same, perhaps, basic principles. We've established, okay, objective morality, moral realism. If they're the same basic sort of moral principles that both frameworks hold, we can't say one is superior to the other. They have the same groundings. I guess perhaps one way you could say that one system could be better in applying it to societies is that, well, secular morality is inclusive of all worldviews. It just doesn't get its morals from religion. And to apply other, perhaps, worldviews that come from a religious framework, if you apply that in societies, that won't be very inclusive of all the demographic of that society that you'll be representing. So secular morality is an inclusive morality system.
Yeah, I think to expand on that just a little bit, the reason why secularity came about was explicitly as a result of conflicting theological beliefs and a need to basically have a structure or society that can account for those differences. Because ultimately, if you have different types of Christianity, if you have different types of religions, if you have non-religious people, you ultimately have to come to some sort of law deliberation system that says, okay, we hear all that, but we need to evaluate together. And the way that we can do that is through secular morality or through some sort of secular system. Ultimately, to go back to the Christian soil thing, there's a reason why all of those theocracies, all of those God-ordained monarchs eventually turned to secular systems as religion and as diversity expanded so incredibly following like the medieval period. So ultimately, you're probably never going to have a very successful theocracy with any sort of diversity ever again. And so ultimately, secular forms of government and legislation will continue to be particularly effective at managing those theological disagreements.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I was probably a bit long-winded on the last one. Sorry about that. Responding to the point of secularism being more inclusive, I think if you're going to be inclusive of every worldview, you end up having none. You end up being inclusive of none, because if someone has a worldview that it's all right to punch people in the face, extreme example, but you know, that sort of conflict does come up, you can't be inclusive of both, right? So we shouldn't be trying to say how many different worldviews can we include in our society's laws, and it's what's the best one, what's the right one? Is there a right one? And I think I'll now talk a bit pragmatically about why Christianity succeeds. I think it's because in Christianity, you can honestly claim that certain actions are right, certain actions are wrong, objectively, irrespective of what other people think. It doesn't have to end up being, well, it's me versus you, it's might versus right. Now, Christians sometimes do use might wrongly, but the point is that you do have a standard you can work to, you do have laws, whereas in secularism, if you're going to try and include everyone, you end up not including anyone.
Yeah, and so we have a question for Monash Christian Union, and then after this we'll have one question and that'll be it. So you stated you would not like to be judged by a human judge who may be biased against you, but prefer to be judged by God who wants the best for you. Please discuss how God had the best interests of mankind when he drowned all on earth except for Noah and his family. If your answer dismisses this as a moral guidance story, how do you determine what you are to take as a suggestion? and what, forgive the pun, is set in stone? I don't see the pun.
Yeah, cool. Good question. That first one about why I'd rather be judged by God than man is simply because God, the God we believe in, is a morally perfect God. It's the God who established the moral standards in this world. It's the God who created us. And that just does not compare to a human being who can be bribed, might be biased. You can never get a non-biased judge. So I'd rather be judged by a God than man. And then coming back to the flood example, I think that just speaks to what we said before, is that we're all enemies of God. And if you read Genesis, it talks about all the detestable things that people were doing on that earth. And it says that Noah was the one who stood out as righteous, meaning he did. He was good in. He didn't look. He did good in God's eyes. So in there, you see some grace, and you see God didn't just erase the human civilization, but He gave human civilization a chance through Noah, and said, "Yeah, I do love these human beings, except they're acting so unjustly, so detestably. That's actually their sin or their irrighteous good. Sorry, that didn't make any sense. Their wicked actions, that can't compute with a God that is morally perfect. So they received the justice that they deserved, and God was gracious in saving Noah and allowing humanity to spread."
So I'll add on as well. So Noah's Ark was sitting there for a long time while he was building it. The doors were open, the doors weren't shut until the floods came. And Noah was saying the whole time, hey, God's going to judge the world. The detestable practices you're doing and things we would look on and say are evil, child sacrifice as an example, and we'd look at that and we'd say, hey, there should be justice for that. And then God delivered justice. And I think the second part of the question I really, really want to get to, because I think it's the heart of the whole debate. It was, how do we know God's good? And we talked about why this actually is showing justice, the flood. But when I look at the life of Jesus Christ, how do I know He's got my best interests in mind? He came, he lived a life that was perfectly righteous. He was sacrificing for other people, and ultimately He died for His enemies. I said the heart of the Christian faith is a man dying on the cross for his enemies, saying, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And I think that demonstrates that God, the God of the universe, He actually has my best interest in mind. So there's a degree of trust there. Like, there's things that I don't understand about Christianity, questions I still have, but they don't ultimately shake my faith, because I know ultimately God does have my best interest in mind. He loves me so much. So while I can't see the whole picture, I trust that, the one who can, the one who loves me, he's doing the right thing.
Yeah, cool. I want to say thanks very much for your questions. We're just going to have one more, and then that's it. But there were over 120 questions submitted, so we'd encourage you to talk to each other about them afterwards as well. There's going to be plenty of time and opportunity for that. We're just going to have one more to finish off.
So I think this last one, I think it's a great way to finish off an otherwise amazing evening. And this question comes from Marcus Young.
What do you think is your opponent's best argument?
Oh, it's a classic. It's a good one. I just thought we had a really good discussion. Like, it was actually productive. We worked through some issues. We didn't agree, but that's okay. I thought we made some ground. So I'm really happy that we were able to do that. So thank you. I think the one thing that I'm going to take away from this, that I'm going to think more on, is the idea of the circularity. I think that was a good point that you raised, and I think that'll take many years to think through. But that's something I'm definitely going to take away and think through. So appreciate that.
Do you guys want to go next? We'll alternate.
How courteous. Yeah, I think it's a really significant question of how to basically ground morality. And so I think hearing such strong argumentation for you guys for God as a source of morality, it always reignites a sense of self-questioning. And so I definitely found that the most important line of argumentation.
Thank you. Initially, I thought Noah's suit that he rocked up in was the best argument. Popping the undone top button. No. I think the point that was made about secularism and I guess plurality was an interesting point. I hadn't heard that before. An argument for why secularism is good, well, because it can account for lots of different ones. It was a different angle I hadn't heard before. I responded to it. I'm not going to respond now because I'm appreciating it. I thought that was actually something out of left field.
The best argument I got, I would say, is that we're not too different in our views of objective morality and all the basic principles, and just seeing that similarity and that there aren't too many, distinct differences is what was interesting to me. Yeah.
Let's give them a hand. Thank you very much. Well done. Well done. Yes, thank you very, very much for that genuinely very interesting discussion. Thank you all for your questions. That concludes our time hearing from our excellent debaters. Now, you may have been listening tonight and thinking, I would really like to keep discussing this, but there are 120 questions. I think we answered about 5, no, probably more than that. But both the Monash Christian Union and the Philosophy Society would love if you got involved with their respective clubs. So here to tell us a bit more about Monash Philosophy Society, please welcome their president, James.
Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. This is the second time I've had the pleasure of overseeing a debate with the Monash Christian Union, and certainly didn't disappoint once again. So it's a pleasure, guys, as always. Just before I continue, I'd like to briefly take this opportunity to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we gathered here this evening, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, just to give you, I could give you a dot point summary of what we do, but I have a better question for you. How many of you have had an existential crisis? Yeah, okay, a few of you, but maybe many of you not so much. Well, as we say, there's a first time for everything. So, if university is one of the best opportunities to try different things. So if you think you might want to give it a crack, come on down to MPS. We certainly don't have it in short supply. Alternatively, if you have, well, think of this as your opportunity to relive your glory days. No, but really, in all seriousness, though, we're a lot of fun. We meet weekly. We get together, talk about a variety of topics over tea and biscuits, and occasionally we mix things up. We have movie nights. We invite guest speakers in, as Pat mentioned earlier. We had the pleasure of welcoming Peter Singer in last year, and we regularly invite other really amazing and renowned speakers in. And we actually have a few joining us next week, which I will share with you all in a moment. We also have our book clubs and reading groups. We run those every Thursday, and if you're interested, you're welcome to join really anytime. We have a different short story each week, so you're not missing out on anything much. Now, we did say earlier that, if you want to hang around and continue the discussion, yes, there will be plenty of time for that this evening, but we'll also be, I think some of the slides might be a little bit behind, but I'll just explain. So tomorrow at Whole Foods from 5 p.m. onward, we'll be gathering to have a follow-up discussion. So if you can't quite get through all of your questions tonight, well, please do join us tomorrow at Monash Whole Foods in Campus Centre. We'll be all getting together with some tea and biscuits, and we'll keep the discussion going from this evening because, look, let's face it, there's there isn't a shortage of things to discuss, and there's plenty more that we could say that we might not have time for this evening. Beyond this, we actually have two very exciting speaker events next week, both on the philosophy of religion. So next Tuesday from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. we have Professor Graham Oppie joining us for a discussion on the history of atheism. Now, if this is something you might want to learn more about, you'll find us in Lecture Theatre M1 over at 35 Rainforest Walk, which is actually just right over there, so it's very close. And on the following night, on Wednesday evening, we have Associate Professor Patrick Stokes joining us from Deakin University, and he will be giving a talk on the Christian existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. So some of you may have heard of him. He had some very interesting ideas, and he was himself a devout Christian, and he had some very interesting ideas on virtue ethics and solving some of the problems that arise within virtue ethics. It'll be a great event. We'll be offering free Danishes because, well, Kierkegaard was Danish, so it makes sense. But we'd love to see you all there, and we'll be opening, it's completely free, but we'll have tickets available hopefully as soon as tomorrow. So I did have a slide, but I think it's a bit behind. So what I'll ask you to do is if you'd like to attend these events or just generally become a member of MPS, you're welcome to scan the QR code here, or you can just visit our link tree and follow us on our social media. So again, if you're contemplating having an existential crisis, give it some thought because you'll feel right at home with us. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you very much for that, James. We will now have Mel, the Vice President of the Monash Christian Union, to come up and tell us a bit about her club.
Cool. Yes. Hello. Hey, everyone. My name is Mel. I'm one of the vice presidents at Monash Christian Union. And I just want to first say a massive thank you to you, James, to MPS, for being so willing to have this public discussion, this public debate, conversation. We live in a pretty divided world and we study on a pretty divided campus. So I want to thank you, Noah and Janset, for cutting through that with just the respect and integrity you showed tonight. We're really grateful. I also just want to tell you guys briefly about CU. We exist because we want you guys to take a fresh look at who Jesus is. He's a really great guy. Yeah, there's plenty of views about him, about what he said, what he did, and we spent some time tonight considering, is he actually worthy of setting the moral standard? And at CU, we believe what the Bible says about Jesus. We do believe he is a good guy, hey? Yeah, we believe that Jesus sets the best example for how to live. He sets the standard for how to live. He sets the moral standard. And we believe Jesus changes everything. So as a club, what do? We have small groups. We have one-on-one catch-ups. We have weekly Bible talks. We run camps. We run lots of social events. We're a club for people questioning Christianity, for people maybe doubting Christianity, for people who perhaps have been hurt by the church, for people who know and accept Jesus, and for people who are still trying to figure out what it means to live in light of him. So if any of these are you tonight, we're so glad you're here. We really are eager to continue the conversation with you, because if Jesus is who he says he is, then that really does change everything. So if you're keen to connect in, there's going to be a QR code, the very next one. This is the one. You can provide some feedback about the debate, and you can also indicate that you're interested in connecting in with CU. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Mel. So yes, as Mel mentioned on the slides, you can follow this QR code to provide feedback for tonight or get connected with either or both clubs. We would love to hear your feedback so that we know what went well, because we crave validation, and also to know what to improve on for future events, because that's the morally right thing for you all to do. Ultimately, however, we hope that tonight's debate got you thinking and that you enjoyed hearing from both sides and from each other. Tonight would not have been possible without lots of hard work from so many people. So I'd like us all to give a big thank you again to our debaters and our moderator, Jean. Thank you very much, you guys. Okay, stop. Now, while official proceedings are done for the evening, we'd encourage you not to run off just yet. Still have questions or want conversations. That's excellent. Look around. You're in a lecture theatre full of people who heard the same debate and maybe even want the same questions answered. In the foyer, you'll find tea, coffee, biscuits, and we hope lots of good convos. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the rest of your evening.